Have you ever been told to show, don't tell, and you've instantly felt your shoulders tense? Because it sounds simple, doesn't it? Just show more, tell less. But then you sit down with your manuscript and think, okay, but how? What exactly am I meant to show? How much description is too much? Am I supposed to add more sensory detail, more action, more body language, perhaps more emotion or more setting? And suddenly this neat little writing rule becomes another thing that you overthink. But today, I'm going to show you a different way to approach it. Because showing versus telling isn't just a craft issue. It's also a creative wiring issue. Because the way you naturally process the world often becomes the way you write the world. If you're a visual writer, you might naturally show what your characters see. If you're auditory, you might hear dialogue, rhythm, tone, and sound before anything else. If you're kinesthetic, you may feel emotion and the scene so deeply in your own body. And if you're auditory digital, you might move straight into meaning, logic, thought, explanation, and internal understanding. None of these are wrong. But when one modality takes over the page, the scene can start to feel lopsided. So today, we're going to look at show, don't tell through the lens of NLP modalities so that you can understand how your creative wiring shapes your writing, where your natural strengths are, and how you can revise your scenes so that they feel fuller, more embodied, and more alive on the page. Because beautiful showing isn't about cramming in more description onto the page. It's about helping your reader experience the moment. So stay with me. If you feel called to write a book, but writer's block, procrastination, and self-doubt keep pulling you from the page, you're not alone, and you're not meant to stay stuck. Hi, I'm Maddison, author and life coach, and I've created this podcast as a creative space grounded in faith and mindset transformations to help you break through your blocks, gain creative clarity, and finally finish the book you're meant to write. So grab your cup of liquid gold and let's write the darn book together. And before we dive in, I'm so excited to let you know that on Feb 26th, I'm hosting a free live masterclass on Zoom called Unlock Your Writing Personality. In this session, I'll be helping you understand how your unique personality traits shape the way you write and how to work with your natural wiring so writing feels clearer, safer, and more aligned. There'll also be an optional VIP upgrade for those of you who want to dive deeper. You'll find all the details in the show notes, or you can visit madisonmichaels.com/masterclass. And now let's get into today's episode. Hello, my friends, and welcome back to Write the Darn Book. I'm your host, Maddison Michaels, and today, Writing Wednesday's episode is all about one of the most common pieces of writing advice that you'll ever hear. Show, don't tell. And if you've been around writing circles for any length of time, you've probably heard that phrase more times than you can count. It gets said in critique groups, writing classes, editorial feedback, craft books, blog posts, social media captions. It's honestly everywhere. And it is useful advice. But it can also be incredibly frustrating advice when nobody explains what it actually means in a way that works for your brain. Because for some writers, show, don't tell immediately translates into, okay, I need to add in more visual description. For others, it becomes, oh, I need more body language. For others, it becomes, oh, I need to make the dialogue sharper. And for others, especially those of us who love meaning and structure and internal logic, it becomes, I need to explain this more clearly so the reader gets it. And that's where things get really interesting. Because today we're going to look at showing versus telling through the lens of your NLP writer's mind modality. So in other words, the way your mind naturally takes in information and it processes story and then it turns it into inner experience on the page. We're going to talk about visual writers, auditory writers, kinesthetic writers, and auditory digital writers, and how each of those modalities can create both beautiful strengths and sneaky little blind spots when it comes to showing instead of telling. And by the end of this episode, I want you to have a practical revision tool that you can take straight back to your manuscript. So grab your coffee, your notebook, or your manuscript if you want to follow along, and let's get into it. Here's where I want to begin today. Most writers think showing versus telling is about description, but it's deeper than that. Showing is about experience. Telling gives readers the conclusion. Showing invites the reader into the moment so that they can feel what is happening for themselves. So if I write, Sarah was nervous, I'm giving you the conclusion. I'm telling you what Sarah's feeling. But if I was to write, Sarah paused in the doorway, her fingers tightening around the strap of her bag while the noise of the room blurred into a dull hum. That is actually inviting you into the experience of what the character's feeling. You can feel the nervousness starting to happen. You're no longer being told what Sarah feels. You're standing in the scene with her. And that is the difference. Telling names the thing. Showing lets the reader live inside it. And this is where your modality matters so much, because the kind of experience you naturally create on the page will usually match the way your own mind processes the world. A visual writer might naturally reach for images. They see the room, the colour of the curtains, the way the light falls across the floor, the expression on the character's face. Whereas an auditory writer might naturally reach for sound. They hear the creak of the floorboards, the clipped tone in someone's voice, the silence after a difficult sentence, and the rhythm of the character's thoughts. A kinesthetic writer might naturally reach for feeling. They feel the tightness in the throat, the heaviness in the chest, the warmth of anger rising through the body, or the pull of longing and perhaps the ache of grief. Whereas an auditory digital writer might naturally reach for meaning. They understand what the moment means, why the character reacts the way they do, what the decision says about the character, and what logic is operating beneath the surface. Each of these is powerful, but when one modality dominates the page, your showing can start to become one-dimensional. A visual scene might look beautiful, but feel emotionally distant. An auditory scene might have great dialogue, but leave the reader unsure of where the characters actually are, what they're doing, or how the conversation is physically landing in the room. A kinesthetic scene might carry really deep emotional truth, but sometimes name the feeling too directly. An auditory digital scene might be clear and insightful, but might drift into explanation rather than lived experience. And this is why some writers can be really good at one type of showing and still receive feedback that their scene feels flat or over-explained or under-described, or perhaps too internal, too theatrical, too vague, or even too emotionally heavy. It's usually because the scene is leaning too hard on one channel of experience. So the goal isn't to abandon your natural modality. The goal is to understand it so you can work with it. Because your dominant modality is part of your writing voice. It's part of your strength and a part of how you connect to the story. And when you know your dominant modality, you can revise more consciously. You can ask yourself, okay, what am I actually or naturally helping the reader experience here? And what have I left out? That question alone can change everything. Now, I'll give you a personal example of how this shows up for me, because I want this to feel practical for you rather than just theoretical. I naturally have a very strong auditory digital side. I love meaning, I love structure, I love understanding why something works, the motivation behind my characters. I love the logic beneath the story, the sentence beneath the sentence. And that is a beautiful strength as a writer and as a coach, because it helps me see patterns. It helps me understand the character's motivation. It helps me explain complex things clearly. It also helps me to build frameworks and to be able to look at a scene and ask, what's actually happening beneath the surface? But on the page, if I'm moving too quickly, that strength can also pull me into explanation. I might understand exactly what a character's feeling, and I might know why she's reacting the way she is, and I might also know the wound underneath her behaviour, perhaps her belief or the fear that goes with that. So that whole emotional architecture of the scene I understand. But if I simply explain that to the reader, I take away their chance to experience it. And this is such an important distinction. As writers, we often know way too much about the story, and we have to, right? We know the backstory. We know the emotional wounds of our characters. We know the secret motivations, what they fear, what they desire. We know the conflict, the history, the longing, the trauma, the resentment, the hope and the heartbreak. We know all of that. And because we know it, we sometimes place it on the page far too directly. We tell the reader she felt abandoned because her father had always chosen work over her. Maybe not in exactly those words, but you get the gist. Now, that sentence might be 100% true and it might be accurate. It might even be important to convey to the reader. But if it lands in the wrong moment, it can feel like the writer has stepped forward into the story and explained the scene instead of the character living it and letting the reader experience that through the character. The stronger question is, how can I turn this meaning into an experience that the reader can feel? Because showing is often not about adding in more words. It's about choosing the details, actions, the sounds and sensations, and the silences that allow the reader to enter the moment. And your dominant modality gives you a clue about the kind of experience you reach for first. Visual writers often reach for what the character sees. They can describe the scene in great detail really well. Auditory writers, though, reach for what they hear or say, so the dialogue and what the character is actually saying. Kinesthetic writers reach for what they feel, that emotional connection in the scene. Auditory digital writers reach for what they understand, decide, realise, or what they tell themselves. None of this is a problem. It's information. And once you have the information, you can use it. So as you revise, ask yourself, where have I put the conclusion on the page? Where could I let the reader instead experience this rather than actually provide that conclusion? That one question can take a scene from flat to alive. Now let's break this down modality by modality. And as I go through these, I want you to listen for yourself and notice which one feels most familiar to you. So notice where you think, oh yeah, that's me, I do that. And also notice where you think, oh, that might be the piece that I'm missing. Because often the modality that feels least natural is the one that can bring a scene to life in a new way. Let's start with visual writers. If you're a visual writer, you might see your story like a film. You notice the room, the light, the colour, the expression on a character's face, the movement of the crowd. And that can be a beautiful gift because it helps the reader picture the story world really clearly. The piece to watch for is that a scene can look beautiful but still feel emotionally distant if the reader has limited access to sound, body, or meaning of the scene as well. So you might write, the ballroom glittered beneath 3 chandeliers, gold lights spilling over silk gowns, polished shoes, and rows of champagne glasses. And visually, that's beautiful. It creates an image. But now, ask yourself, what else does the reader need to experience? What can they hear? So you could add in something like, the ballroom glittered beneath 3 chandeliers, gold lights spilling over silk gowns, polished shoes, and rows of champagne glasses. Laughter rose in bright bursts from the far side of the room. Now we have sound added to that little paragraph. But then we want to think, well, what can they feel? So after the laughter, we might then talk about laughter rose in bright bursts from the far side of the room, but Clara's gloves clung damply to her palms. Now the scene started to shift. We're inside the character's body, so that's the kinesthetic aspect. And then we want to look at, well, what meaning sits underneath this moment? So we might add after that, she'd imagined this entrance for weeks. but never once had she imagined arriving alone. So now then we understand some of the emotional context. So the scene becomes fuller because we've allowed visual strength to remain, but then we've added a bit of sound and body and meaning. So visual writers keep that cinematic quality. That's part of your gift. But just remember that a beautiful image becomes even stronger when the reader can also hear the room or feel the character's body or understand why the image matters. Now let's move to auditory writers. If you're an auditory writer, you might connect to story through sound and rhythm and dialogue, through tone, perhaps even silence and voice. You might hear your characters before you see them, and you might know exactly how a line should land. You might also feel when dialogue sounds off, and you might hear the cadence of a scene. You might also be deeply sensitive to the music of language, the rhythm of sentences, and the tension in a pause. And this is such a powerful writing gift. Auditory writers often create strong, sparkling dialogue. They understand subtlety in the text and in the speech. And this also goes in part the same for auditory digital writers too, which I will talk about shortly, but keep that in mind as well. Now, auditory writers know that what a character says and how they say it can reveal so much more than a paragraph of an explanation. The piece to watch for auditory writers is making sure that the reader has enough physical grounding. So the dialogue might be super strong, but the reader might have trouble picturing where the characters are, what they're doing, or how the conversation is landing in the room. So an auditory writer might naturally write something like, "You should have told me," he said, his voice low enough that nobody else at the table turned. And that's already doing some lovely showing. We hear the voice, we sense the restraint, we get tension. But now we can build it. We can think, what can we see? So perhaps it could go like, "You should have told me," he said, his voice low enough that nobody else at the table turned. His hands stayed flat beside his glass, fingers spread out against the white linen. Now you can see his restraint. But now think, well, what else? What could we feel? So perhaps you could then add in, his hands stayed flat beside his glass, fingers spread against the white linen, while heat crept up the back of Amelia's neck. Now we're in the body. What's the meaning then behind the exchange? Well, we could add a line, "She'd prepared for anger. She hadn't prepared for disappointment." So now we understand some of the emotional sting. So auditory writers, your ability to hear the scene is such a beautiful strength, but just remember to give those voices bodies. Give the dialogue a room to land in and let silence carry weight on the page. Because silence is one of the most powerful auditory tools you have. A character saying nothing can show more than a paragraph of explanation if we understand the moment around it. Now, kinesthetic writers, if you're a kinesthetic writer, you might process story through feeling, sensation, emotion, the atmosphere of a scene and the body as well, so the character's body and their emotions. You will probably feel your characters deeply, and you might know where a scene is right because it lands in your chest or your stomach or your throat. You might write best when you feel physically settled, emotionally connected, and able to enter that lived experience of the character. This is such an amazing gift. Kinesthetic writers can create emotionally resonant scenes. They often understand vulnerability, tension, longing, grief, fear, and desire in a very embodied way. And they can make the reader feel the emotional truth of the moment. The piece to watch for, though, is naming the feeling too quickly. Because when the feeling is so strong inside you, it can feel natural to write, perhaps Daniel felt guilty, or she just felt so overwhelmed, or he was heartbroken. And again, those statements might be true, but they give the reader the label rather than the experience. So as a kinesthetic writer, your showing pass is about translating the feeling into something the reader can experience on the page. So perhaps instead of "she was overwhelmed," you might want to write, "She read the first line of the email 3 times, then placed the phone down on the table. The room seemed too bright, the air too close, her skin too tight. Now the reader feels overwhelmed without actually needing the word overwhelmed. Instead of, he was heartbroken, you could write, he picked up her mug from the sink, the chipped blue one she always used, and stood with it in both hands until the kettle clicked off behind him. Now we can feel grief perhaps through the object, through the action, through that stillness and the ritual. Kinesthetic writers, your depth is a gift. The revision skill is learning how to shape that depth into something the reader can experience. So your job isn't to make the emotion smaller, your job is to give it somewhere to live on the page. Let the character's body, their behaviour, objects, movement and atmosphere carry the feeling on the page rather than naming the feeling too quickly. Now let's talk about auditory digital writers. So if you're an auditory digital writer, you process strongly through language, logic, analysis, internal self-talk, so audio is still very important to you as well, and also through structure and meaning and thought. You might be really aware of what something means. You might understand character psychology, plot function, theme, motivation, belief systems, and cause and effect. You might also naturally ask, why is this happening? What does this mean? What's the point of this moment? And what's the structure underneath it? That is an incredibly valuable writing strength. Auditory digital writers often have strong thematic awareness, so they can create intelligent layered work. They can build systems, arguments, internal logic, and character motivation with precision. The piece to watch for is moving into explanation before the reader has been invited into the moment. The scene might tell us what the character realizes before the reader has had a chance to actually feel that realization forming. It might explain the emotional pattern instead of dramatizing it. It might move into analysis when the scene needs action. So an auditory digital writer might write something like, Emma realized she'd spent her whole life trying to earn love from people who were never going to give it freely. Now that's a strong insight. It might even be the emotional truth of the scene. But if we put that insight onto the page too early, the reader receives the conclusion of that lived experience without actually living it themselves. So instead, we can ask, how do we turn that realization into a moment that the reader can enter and experience? Maybe we could write something like, Emma looked at the message again. 3 words. Can't make it. No apology, no explanation, no promise to try next time. She set her phone down carefully, as if sudden movement might crack something open, and stared at the birthday cake cooling on the bench. Now the reader can begin to understand the pattern because they've experienced the moment with her. And then later, perhaps after the moment has landed, the thought can come in. She had mistaken waiting for loyalty. She could see that now. So that line works because the scene has earned it. And this is the big thing for auditory digital writers. Your insight is powerful. Your job is to let the reader live inside the scene before you name the insight. Let the reader see the message, hear the silence, feel that stillness, watch her hand lower. Notice the cake on the bench, then the meaning lands. Auditory digital writers, your ability to understand that deeper meaning is a beautiful strength. Just remember to embody that understanding through action, image, sound, sensation, and consequence. Because meaning becomes more powerful when the reader experiences it before it's actually named on the page. Now, I want to give you all a practical tool that you can use this week. I call this the 4-modality showing pass. What I want you to do is take one paragraph or one scene or even one moment from your manuscript where you feel you might be telling too much or where the scene feels a little flat. Then I want you to read it through 4 times. On the first pass, look for the visual. Ask, what can the reader see? So where are we? What room are we in? What's the character doing? What are they wearing? What object matters? What movement reveals the emotion? What facial expressions, gestures, or physical details carry meaning? Now, not all of that has to be in there, but that's some questions you can ask in terms of visually, what can the reader see? Then on the second pass, listen for the auditory. So ask yourself, what can the reader hear in this scene or this moment? You might think, is there dialogue? What's the tone? Is there any silence? Is there a sound in the room? A sound outside the room? What about the breathing, footsteps, a door closing, a kettle clicking off? The absence of sound that should perhaps be there. So all of that can help you understand the auditory side of the scene and can the reader hear anything? On the third pass, feel for the kinesthetic. So ask yourself, what can the reader feel here? So what's happening in the character's body? Do they have a tight throat, damp palms, heavy limbs, warm cheeks? Is there pressure behind their ribs? What's the emotional atmosphere of the room? Is the air tense, intimate, brittle, heavy, electric? Then what I want you to do on the fourth pass, look for the auditory digital layer. Ask, what meaning is being implied? So what does this moment mean to the character? What do they believe here? What decision is forming? What realization might be beginning? What old pattern is being repeated? And what truth is the scene quietly revealing? And again, not all of that's going to be present, but that's going to give you an indication of actual meaning that is being implied in that scene. Now, here's the important part. You absolutely might not need all 4 modalities in equal measure. It's absolutely not a checklist where every paragraph needs one visual detail, one sound, one body sensation, and one thought. Not at all. That would become very mechanical very quickly. This is simply a diagnostic tool. It helps you see what's present, what's missing, and what the scene is asking the reader to experience. You might just need to add in a little bit of dialogue or a little bit of emotional feeling. It really depends on the purpose of what's going on in that scene. But when your scene might feel flat or thin or over-explained or emotionally vague, then this tool gives you a way in. So you can ask yourself, which modality is dominating this scene? Which modality is underused? What is going to help the reader experience this moment more fully? So let's do a simple example together. Telling version could be, Lucy was angry that Mark had forgotten their anniversary. That tells us the conclusion, okay? So that is telling, not showing. Now let's run it through the modality lenses. Visual, Lucy stared at the untouched dinner plates, the candles burnt low between them. From the auditory lens, the clock ticked loudly in the kitchen. Mary's key scraped in the lock at 10:30. From a kinesthetic viewpoint, her jaw tightened before she turned toward the door. Auditory digital, she'd reminded him twice. This time, the forgetting felt like an answer. So then we could look at blending some of them. How about Lucy stared at the untouched dinner plates, the candles burnt low between them. The clock ticked loudly in the kitchen. When Mark's keys finally scraped in the lock at 10:30, her jaw tightened before she turned toward the door. She'd reminded him twice. This time, the forgetting felt like an answer. Can you feel how much more alive that is than just one on its own? And remember, you don't have to have all of them, but if you look at, do we have an image? Do we have a sound? Do we have the body? Do we have the meaning? That can sometimes give a much stronger picture. We've shown the anger in that scene without needing to say, Lucy was angry. Yep. And even more importantly, we've allowed the reader to experience what that anger means. Because in strong writing, emotion rarely exists alone. Anger might actually be masking hurt. Nervousness could actually be longing, and frustration might actually be fear. So there is so many options that you can use. And when you use all 4 modalities or a combination of some of them with intention, you can start revealing those deeper layers through the scene. And this is what makes showing powerful. So, my friends, I want you to have a think about your own modality, and then I want you to think, is that modality perhaps taking over my writing a bit? So, if you're visually heavy, you might notice long paragraphs of setting or appearance, but limited access to the character's body, voice, or internal shift. The writing might look beautiful, but the emotional current might need strengthening. If you're auditory heavy, you might notice pages of dialogue with minimal grounding or description, and the voices might be strong, but the reader might start wondering where the characters are or what they're doing and how the conversation's landing physically. If you're kinesthetic heavy, you might notice a lot of emotional language, body sensations, heaviness, tightness, warmth, etc. And that can be powerful, but the scene might also need some sharper external action, some setting, or some dialogue to give the emotion form. If you're auditory digital, then you might notice phrases like, she realised, he knew, she understood, he wondered, she thought, he recognised, etc. And those phrases can be useful, but if they dominate the page, they might signal that the scene is being explained rather than experienced. Again, these aren't errors, they're clues. So instead of looking at your writing and thinking, oh no, I'm doing this wrong again, you can instead look at it and think, this is my wiring showing up on the page. And once you can see it, you can shape it. And that is so much more empowering in terms of revision. Because this isn't about silencing your natural voice. It's about expanding your range and learning how to support your natural strength with the other modalities. And that is how a scene becomes immersive. If today's episode has you thinking, oh my gosh, I can see exactly how my writing brain is showing up on the page, then I'd love to invite you to take this deeper. Because this is exactly the kind of thing we look at inside my Writing Personality Blueprint sessions. These are personalized sessions where we look at how you are uniquely wired to write. So we look at your bird writing personality and your natural writing patterns, so the way you tend to move into creative flow, the way resistance tends to show up, and how your creative wiring might be shaping what happens both at the desk and on the page. And when you understand that, you can build a writing process that works for you rather than one that makes you feel as though you have to become a completely different kind of writer. So if you'd love to understand your unique writing personality and your creative wiring more deeply, then head to madisonmichaels.com/blueprint and book in a Writing Personality Blueprint session. And if you'd love to begin by discovering your writing personality and your dominant modality, then you can also take my free quizzes at madisonmichaels.com/quiz. Because, my friends, your writing patterns aren't random. The way you write, the way you get stuck, the way you revise, and the way you show emotion actually gives us information. And once we understand that information, we can work with it. So as we wrap up today, I want you to remember this. Show, don't tell isn't about following a rule perfectly. It's about helping your reader experience the story fully. And your modality is one of the most powerful clues as to how you naturally do that. If you're visual, let us see, then remember to help us hear and feel. If you're auditory, let us hear, but then remember to place those voices inside bodies and rooms. If you're kinesthetic, let us feel the emotion and then remember to give that feeling action, movement and shape. And if you're auditory digital, let us understand, but then remember to let the reader live inside the scene before you name the insight. Your natural modality is part of your gift. And the more you understand it, the more intentionally you can use it. So this week, take one scene from your manuscript and run it through the 4 modality showing paths. Look for what's already strong and look for what wants to be added. And let the scene become a fuller experience for the reader. Because, my friends, remember, you are the vessel for your story. And part of your work as a writer is learning how that story wants to move through you, through your mind, through your body, through your voice, and onto the page. Until next time, my friends, take care, and let's write the darn book together. My friend, I hope today's episode gave you exactly what you needed for your writing journey. And if it did, would you take 30 seconds to share it with another writer who's struggling to start or finish their book? And if you're loving the show, I'd be so grateful if you left a quick review. It means the world to me and truly makes my day to know that this podcast is helping you. And as you head back into your week, I hope you feel more supported and connected to your creativity. And remember, you're a vessel for the story. So let the words flow through you and onto the page. All right, I'm off to refill my cup of liquid gold and go and do a little writing of my own. Take care, and I'll meet you back here in the next episode of Write the Darn Book.